Welcome to another episode of Research Series. I'm your host, Amanda Wijayanti, and today we have extraordinary guest joining us, Professor Samuel Bazzi. He's a renowned scholar in development economics and political economy from University of California, San Diego. Professor Bazzi's research focuses on how individuals and nations adapt to diversity with particular attention to labor mobility and migration cultural impacts. He has a strong regional focus on Southeast Asia, especially in Indonesia. And in this opportunity, we will discuss regarding diversity as an economic engine, unlocking growth potential. So, without further ado, let's dive into this. Please welcome Professor Samuel Bazzi. Thank you very much for being here today. How are
Thank you.
you?
I'm great. Thank you for the kind invitation. It's very nice to be here with you today, Amanda.
Yeah, this must be not your first time in Indonesia, right?
Yeah, no, I've been coming here for about 20 years, actually. I lived here for 1 year in 2005 and 2006, and have been coming back very regularly ever since then. And, I have lots of Indonesian friends and collaborators and co-authors, and yeah.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I'm sure that everyone is curious about your research, so let's start our session today. First of all, what do you think about the intersection of development and political economy? What makes it interesting for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think right now in development economics, we have built up a very large base of evidence on what works, right? We know lots of policies and interventions that work at improving human capital, that work at creating a more conducive investment environment for firms and individual entrepreneurs. We know a lot about the types of training programs that work for improving labor market outcomes, how to fight poverty through social safety nets and transfers. And so we know a lot about what works, right? And now the challenge is figuring out exactly how to implement these programs, given that in the real world, when governments take over programs, there are all kinds of challenges, right? And these challenges stem from different actors outside the government that may be resistant to policy change, stems from challenges within the government in terms of different agencies and bureaucratic kind of frictions to implementing new policies. And so this is where political economy really comes in and really helps us understand exactly how to troubleshoot these bottlenecks and frictions to implementing policies that we know how to make them work well and effectively, but we need to figure out how exactly to get the key stakeholders and agents to implement those optimal policies. And so that's where I see this really exciting intersection happening right now between development and political economy. And you see a lot of exciting work happening in terms of thinking about the personnel economics of the government, of the bureaucracy, in terms of thinking about the role of informal institutions, the role of kind of community networks in shaping development outcomes. And so there's just a lot of exciting work happening that's bringing together kind of the best of political economy and the best of development economics to come up with a kind of menu of policy reforms and a roadmap for how to implement those reforms.
It is truly multi-dimension, yeah, because it will involve so many stakeholders, from the one in the government, in the informal sectors too, and then the people, the political situation and everything, right?
Exactly. No, it's a very, there are lots of challenges given all these different actors that are involved. And, as researchers, when we design evaluations of new programs or try to understand the impact of programs that NGOs have implemented, we try to kind of keep things as simple as possible and kind of strip out the complexities of the different actors and institutions involved so we can focus really on the program itself. But then the problem is, how do you take that very clean, controlled experiment or natural experiment and then translate it into a context where, the messy politics of implementation
it's true.
are really first order in figuring out how to get these things to work and kind of be self-sustaining.
Are there any emerging trends or developments in the field that you find particularly exciting or promising?
Yeah, I think one thing that I think is quite exciting is the interaction that we're seeing a lot more of between political scientists and economists. And it's really kind of most salient in the field of development economics, where you have a lot of individuals working on kind of political and institutional change, and talking to political scientists who are working on a lot of the same issues, sometimes from a different perspective. And so I see a lot of fruitful interactions happening between economists and political scientists. And it's really happening kind of in development, but also in political economy more broadly. And so I think that interdisciplinary conversation is one that is quite promising and should bear fruit in the years ahead.
That's very interesting. I think you are right, because we need a multidisciplinary approach, right, to face the problem that we have today. But sometimes political scientists and economists might not see in the same view, right?
Yeah, that's
sometimes.
right. That's right. And for a long time, I think there was this sense that the two fields were just moving in parallel, oftentimes thinking about different issues, and when they were thinking about the same issues, they didn't agree on methods or theoretical frameworks. And I think there's still, of course, a little bit of that, but at least among the younger generation, what I see is a lot more convergence between the two fields. And I think there's a lot of kind of hope for change in the future, and more of that convergence that I think, at the end of the day, we have our disciplinary homes, we're economists, we're political scientists, or sociologists, or anthropologists, but we're social scientists, right? And we should always remember that, and I think it's important to kind of keep that broad, general grounding in the fact that we're all studying social phenomena, and we may approach it through slightly different lenses and methods and frameworks, but at the end of the day, we have a lot to learn from each other, I think.
That's true. Well, some of your well-known publication, including one of that was titled "Unity in Diversity: How Intergroup Contact Can Foster National Building." The research context of the paper was in Indonesia, right? Why did you choose Indonesia, and what makes Indonesia unique?
Yeah, I mean, Indonesia, for anyone studying diversity, is truly an amazing laboratory. It's one of the most diverse countries in the world. That diversity stems from its very complex geography across an archipelago that's as big, if not bigger, than the continental United States. And so I think, there's just on its face, a wonderful place to think about challenges of managing diverse populations and think about some of these core issues around the way that diversity shapes human behavior in a social setting. And what was really kind of motivating us to tackle these questions in the context of Indonesia as well is the fact that Indonesia embarked on one of the world's largest population resettlement programs, known as transmigration. Transmigration. And so I teamed up with an Indonesian economist, Arya Gadu, a fellow grad student at Berkeley, Alex Rothenberg, and Maisie Wong, someone who has a background in the region as well from Malaysia. And together we teamed up and brought our own diverse perspectives to thinking about diversity. And we're able to use the program, that transmigration program, which brought millions of migrants from different parts of Indonesia and created these new communities from the ground up, like built these communities from scratch, and did so in a way that brought different ethnic groups together. And it's very rare if you look around the world that you have this kind of controlled government-led effort to create these mixed communities, right? And so that was really the jumping off point for that project that allowed us to answer a whole set of questions that would be much more difficult to study in a context where people can freely choose where to settle, who their neighbors are. In those contexts, you're going to get some places that are diverse, but those places are special, right? And so it's going to be hard to
like California, for example.
Yeah, California or Jakarta. I mean, look at Jakarta.
That's right.
It's very, very diverse, right? And it's diverse for a reason. There's lots of opportunities and an openness to the world. And so studying diversity in a place like that would be a little challenging because it's diverse for reasons that are maybe unrelated to the kind of policies that would give rise to diversity in a more controlled context.
That's interesting. Is Indonesia the only country who has transmigration? I mean, no other country do that?
No, it's interesting. There are other countries that have resettlement programs of various forms. Some of them are forced resettlement programs. Some of them are voluntary, right? Like the transmigration program was largely voluntary. There were episodes where there was kind of forced resettlement, but by and large, at least in the period we study, it was voluntary. And there are other countries that have programs like this. There are a few in sub-Saharan Africa. Tanzania has a famous one. But in many ways, the scale and kind of the nature of the Indonesian resettlement program is quite unique.
Do you think it's better for having the government direct people to move somewhere, or is it better that people just choose where they want to move?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, I think there are advantages to having the government manage some of the migration flows, but it's also very challenging to do that. So I think it would be very hard today for the government of Indonesia to implement a program of this on the same scale as transmigration in the 1980s, like the period we study. What I think governments can do and should do is create conditions and opportunities for people to move to places that are more representative of their own interests and also have opportunities that are well matched to their ambition and aspirations. As to kind of managing such a large scale kind of creation of new communities, and I think that is something that is probably not necessarily what I would recommend governments do and kind of scale up the Indonesian policy as it was.
Interesting. Well, your research found that fractionalized communities with many small groups show greater national integration. Could you elaborate about these findings?
Yeah, so when we think about fractionalized communities, what we're thinking about are places where I have lots of neighbors from a different group from my own, right? But it's not just that all of my neighbors who aren't in my group are from one other group. It's that they're from many different groups, right? That's really what we mean by a fractionalized community. And in those contexts, it's not clear like who should be the dominant group culturally, right? And so if we have we all speak our own languages, our own native ethnic languages when we show up in this community. Which group's language should be the one that we use when we interact with each other in the market, in the local religious institution? What language should we be speaking with each other, right? It's not obvious. And when there's many groups, you have many to choose from, and it's not clear who should be the dominant one. And so in that context, it would be great if we had a third identity, a third option that we could kind of coordinate on, right? And that's exactly what Bahasa Indonesia, the national language of Indonesia, that's exactly what it provides, right? It provides that third option that we can all speak together and kind of use as a vehicle for integration, for cultural integration, and bring us together. And some of us will still continue speaking Indonesian, speaking our native ethnic language at home. But a lot of us may, in fact, start embracing Indonesian as the main language that we use at home to socialize our kids. We look around as parents in our fractionalized community and we see lots of different groups, this breadth of diversity, and think, this is the future. Maybe we should be socializing our children in Indonesian so that they can feel more connected to people from other ethnic groups in their community.
Interesting. Following on that, why do polarized communities with large groups experience increased ethnic attachment and reduced integration?
Yeah, so in some ways, polarized communities are really at the kind of exact opposite of fractionalized ones. In this case, what you can think of in the most extreme case, I think it's helpful to think about villages like this. The most polarized places are places where you have two groups that are equal size, right? 50% one group, 50% another. Now in that context, your group is big enough on its own that you don't actually need to interact with the other group.
It's true.
Right? You don't really need to interact with them. You can maybe even have your own schools, your own markets, right? Your own businesses. You don't even need to interact with them in your community, right? And so in that context, the incentives for coordinating on that third form of identity are pretty weak, right? And moreover, if there's one village government that you're going to be, you and the other group are going to be potentially vying for control of, right? Maybe through local elections, through other informal avenues of kind of influencing government, there's going to be really strong competition because you really want your group to have control of the government, because then you get to decide how to spend public resources, what policies to implement at the at the village level, and so the incentives for competition and conflict in these polarized communities are just much higher than in those fractionalized places.
Because it's like identity versus another identity, right?
Exactly. It just pits the two groups together. Yeah.
Okay. How do economic inequalities and linguistic difference between ethnic groups influence the outcomes of intergroup contact?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, the short answer is that both of those factors, linguistic distance and inequality in resources between groups, is just going to exacerbate the tensions, right? If you have two groups in that polarized community, and their languages aren't that different, their cultures aren't that different, maybe the frictions will be relatively limited, right? But if these groups are very different from each other, that's just going to kind of create more of an incentive for the two groups to kind of separate and create their own entrenched communities within the larger village community. And then in thinking about economic inequality, that's also going to create tensions, right? Because if my group comes in with more resources or has greater assets or skills than the other group, that other group is going to see us being more successful economically, and that could create some additional animosity that will be lumped together with our identity difference. Now we see this economic difference, and they're going to kind of compound each other.
Conflict like that, I think it could happen, regardless developing countries or developed countries, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, look at the U.S. right now and other countries as well that have very high levels of political polarization. It's a lot of the same dynamics. Obviously, in thinking about a country like the U.S., where you have the two political parties and high levels of polarization, it doesn't kind of fall exactly along ethnic or religious lines in the same way that it might in other countries, but it's the same kind of deep-rooted dynamics of feeling alienation from the other group,
the
and a
alienation.
really strong sense of identity within your own group. And those two things can just kind of pull societies apart at the seams.
Yeah, even in Indonesia, I mean, we are pretty diverse in terms of politics. We are not just two parties, right? In terms of religion and ethnics, yet it is still common to see that people are sometimes, polarized. We're not the same with the other group and things like that, right?
Yeah, that's right. But I do think one advantage of having a multi-party political system like you have here, and having a proportional representation system in local and national parliaments, is that it doesn't create the same kind of incentives for political conflict, right? Now, of course, we've seen elections in the last decade in Indonesia that have been very polarized.
Yep, it's
but
true.
we've also seen ones that have not been so polarized, right? And I think that kind of variation from one election to the next it can be a strength of the kind of democratic system that exists here, where you have the ability to kind of move between ideological streams within the political party landscape. Coalitions can change.
Yeah, coalition
These forces are part of healthy democratic processes that I think are being potentially lost in places that don't have that same kind of plethora of parties like you have here and in other democracies.
Interesting. What advice would you give to researchers or practitioners interested in exploring intersection of development and political economy?
Yeah, so I would certainly recommend thinking very hard about how to take the evidence that we have on the programs that work, and there's a lot of great evidence on this in Indonesia, right? A whole body of amazing research on in development economics. And for those who are thinking hard about how to implement these policies, I would suggest really engaging with the political economy kind of research landscape and try and get a sense of what if we wanted to scale this program up, if we wanted to get political buy-in for this particular program, who would we need to persuade in government? What kind of messaging would we need to provide to voters who might be skeptical of this policy? Who are the different coalitions across the different political parties, across the different ministries who have their own interests? Think hard about the kind of agency problems that might exist in the bureaucracy, and what sorts of policies might move the right actors to become more aligned with the objectives of the optimal kind of policy planner.
That's actually a very practical approach, yeah?
Yeah.
When we are still students, like when I was a student in economics, I would think hard about how the theory of economy is going to work, but actually when we do research, we kind of want to do it in the more evidence-based, right? So more practical approach like you just mentioned before.
Exactly. I think the key is figuring out how to use evidence and translate evidence into something that is actionable and acknowledges the challenges of implementing good policy.
Interesting. What do you hope readers and practitioners take away from your research on intergroup contact and nation building in particular?
Yeah, I would love for people to kind of take away from this work that diversity has a kind of complex complex nature, right? It has this potential upside in a context where you can kind of harness the breadth of groups and think about how to build incentive structures that encourage coordination on shared identity, right? What's really key is thinking about shared identities and how we can help build shared identities, right? And Indonesia is a kind of quintessential example of doing this and building the Indonesian identity, and doing so in a way that allows people to kind of maintain their own native ethnic identities, but also feel very much like they belong to the Indonesian nation. And so I think thinking about how to how to manage diversity in a context where you have the possibility of polarization, but you also have the possibility of creating these new shared forms of identity that nevertheless can allow people to maintain some of their other identities without fully abandoning them as they become part of this more cohesive shared form of identity.
That's so interesting. If I may conclude our discussion, so diversity can be key, right, for development, because diversity will always be there, because Indonesia especially, we have so many diverse people in terms of ethnic, religious, and so on and so forth. So we need to consider that, and also we need a multidisciplinary approach, right, for development, especially in a country like this.
Yes. Exactly. I would fully endorse everything you just said.
I just summarized what you just said. All right. Thank you very much, Professor Bazzi, for being here. As we wrap up today's enlightened episode of Diversity as an Economic Engine, Unlocking Growth Potential, I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you for Professor Bazzi for sharing his time and profound insight with us. Your expertise in development has not only enriched our understanding, but also inspired us to think more critically about the global issue we face. Professor Bazzi, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on our research series episode. Thank you for tuning in and being part of this engaging conversation. See you on the next episode of Research Series. Good day.